Deputy Secretary. That was fantastic. I think we've got 6 or 7 minutes to dig in a little bit. Clearly, the Treasury's been doing the work when it comes to equity. You set goals a year ago. You reported on against those goals. You just announced the new commission. 2 questions, if I may, to sort of start us off. One is, if you could have spin out a little bit more of how are you thinking about equity conceptually? And then B is, walk us through the next couple of years. What does the work look like? Like, you've been doing the work. Where does the work go from now to enact and sort of continue to act on the equity agenda?
Thank you for that. And I think that Secretary Yellen and I agree on 2 things. One, that equity is a critically important moral issue, but it is also an essential economic issue to unlocking the growth of the American economy. And when I talk about this as the Treasury Department, the thing we are thinking through is, how do we make the American economy the most competitive it can be in the 21st century? And we know that the place in America today where the most unlocked potential exists is in marginalized communities. That's why we're focused on equity, because we know that it is a moral imperative, but also it is an economic imperative for our country. So how do you do that, though? And I think from the standpoint of the way that we do the work at Treasury, it starts from the beginning in terms of having the right people in place to be able to do that work. Yep. The Secretary appointed the department's first racial equity counselor early on in our term. That was one step. We have created a unit within Treasury that is staffed by career officials who are thinking through how every single policy that we work on keeps equity in mind, how we think about the way that it will impact people of color, rural communities that have been left behind, how we can use this in a way that will make sure that we increase labor force participation amongst women in this country. And then finally, from a people standpoint, making sure that we have an advisory committee that was just announced the other day that can do 2 things. Provide us advice based on their lived experience about how we can do this work better at Treasury, but also hold us accountable to the commitments that we've made to all of you. And we are proud about the group of people who have made up that 25-person advisory committee, and we look forward to working with them on that. But the last piece, and the piece I spoke about in my remarks, is execution. Ultimately, people pay a lot of attention. One of my bosses said this, that people pay a lot of attention as the legislation goes through Congress and everybody attends the signing ceremony, but then everybody turns around and moves on to the next thing. The reality for all of us has got to be, we have to focus on execution in a real way, because execution is the place where equity comes to fruition. Because the ability for certain communities to get access to these tax credits or to the investments that government are being made all happen in the execution. So for us as an agency, we're very focused on making sure that we execute these new tremendous legislation in a way that is additive to building our economy, and that means investing in these communities that have been underinvested in for too long.
I'm glad you raised the question of execution. Just in my conversation with my colleagues, I think many of us recognize this is a generational opportunity. As Felicia said earlier, $4 trillion of investment. John said it in his comments as well. Let's dig in on industrial policy and equity specifically, because when I think about it, it could point, there's some reasons for potentially optimism, and there's some reasons for caution. I'll ask about racial equity, and we'll come to the question of gender equity in a minute. But could you spin out for us a little bit your thoughts on that question, and sort of weave in the conversation about how we attend to implementation in the next couple of years, because that's sort of where the action is going to be.
Yeah, and I think that from our standpoint, one of the things that we think about is that the reason that we have went to Congress to get the authority to make these historic investments is because we think that they are critical to unlocking the potential of the entire U.S. economy. But in order to do that, you're going to need people to do the work. Yeah. And when we look at the labor market today in the United States, again, we had another very positive labor report. But one of the things we're focused on is, how do we get more people into the labor force? And today, when you look at the data, you'll see that we're at a historic high point in terms of Hispanics who are in the labor market today, in terms of, you've seen a huge decrease in unemployment amongst that population. You've also seen that amongst Black women, but there's still room to go in terms of bringing more people of color, more marginalized communities, more women back into the labor force, in order to put us in a better position to do the work that it's going to take to actually implement these historic policies that we've done. And we don't only want to bring them back into the labor force, but we want to make sure that these individuals have access to well-paying jobs when they enter the labor force. That's why the labor and apprenticeship language that was in the IRA was so important, and why we're so focused at the Treasury Department on implementing that well in order to make sure that what we're creating is a virtuous cycle in these communities where we're building things, but we're building them with the people who live there.
I'm glad you mentioned the question of labor as well. John mentioned it earlier in his comments today. There's some reporting, I think Lee Harris might be here from the Prospect, that there are many tools in the current legislation, and yet there are tools that you all in the administration wanted and didn't get. What does that agenda look like to sort of marry labor rights to weave labor rights into the industrial policy agenda in the years ahead, and what additional tools are in the toolbox that you might be able to deploy?
So I do think that we do have some significant tools that came in the IRA, historic ones, because traditionally when you think about the tax code, we haven't traditionally married the tax code with labor protections in the way that we're doing here. This is one of the first times that we're doing this. I think it's going to come down to implementation, and we're very committed to the idea of both providing guidance, but then also making sure that we have the ability to design a compliance regime that will create the incentives to make sure that we're in a place where the firms that are getting these credits do actually implement the types of labor standards that are going to be additive to workers. But in addition to the incentives that we're going to create with the Inflation Reduction Act, I do think that we have to use the bully pulpit in some ways to call on these companies who are building up the ecosystem that will come around all three of the pieces of legislation to do what is not only the right thing to do morally, but is the right thing for them to do economically. And I think that's why, in lots of ways, we've got to engage with those stakeholders and remind them that they made these commitments after the murder of George Floyd to invest money in these communities. But it's not only about investing money in these communities in terms of putting money into them, but when I sit down with business leaders or small business owners, which I do from time to time, and meet with them, be they minority-owned businesses or women-owned businesses, in addition to getting access to money and financing, they need access to customers. They need jobs. And I think that we have to hold people accountable for looking at what they're doing there, using the bully pulpit, as well as using the legislative tools that we've already been given.
Being given the signal, we got to run. Let me ask just 30 seconds on gender equity is a critical component of how we think about building a fair economy and industrial policy. Just your quick comments on that, and then we'll wrap here. So.
My view is that one of the things that we need to do is make sure that we're making the investments that unlock the potential of all Americans to enter the labor force. And I think this is one of those places where we've seen some gains amongst populations in terms of labor force participation, but a place where we know there's more work to do is that we need to unlock the potential of more women to come back into the labor force. Since the pandemic, we've seen that data go in the wrong direction. We've seen some improvement, but it speaks to the fact that right now our economy needs to do a better job for all caregivers is one thing that we need to do. The second thing that I think we've got to do is make sure that as we're thinking about these jobs, be they technical jobs or jobs in construction, that we're thinking about them in a way that unlocks the ability of small businesses that are run by women or minorities or other marginalized groups to be able to be contractors for these jobs in order to allow them to build up the ecosystem going forward. And part of this is making sure that we do the things that are on the books today in terms of the laws, but it gets to my broader point, which is that we need to build a system of accountability so that people who have made these commitments, companies that have made these commitments that are operating in these communities, actually keep those commitments. And that is going to be something that I know that the people in this room are going to help to do, but it's something that we as an administration also need to do, working closely with you.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mr. Deputy Secretary. Really appreciate your time. Thanks, everybody.